In the UK these days, something can be observed in a relatively short space of time that has dragged on for years or decades elsewhere: the failure of a utopia. What is meant is, how could it be otherwise, is Brexit. But Brexit itself is, from a purely technical point of view, an irrefutable fact. What is currently bursting, however, are the ideas that Brexit supporters have built up around the EU exit. And one key word would be the almost forgotten slogan, Global Britain. British Eurosceptics have long held the idea that an unfettered Britain would once again sit at the table with the world's superpowers on an equal footing as soon as it could free itself from the EU, which was far too small and unimportant for its circumstances. Behind these dreams there was often nothing more than empire nostalgia. And the opposite has happened. The EU exit has diminished Britain's international standing and damaged the country's reputation. For years, one has seen British heads of government trying more or less unsuccessfully to get involved in debates as important contacts and stuff, in photos with other heads of state and government, which often give an indication of the international status of states. One sometimes has to look for the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for a long time, and not just because he is relatively small. If he had not supported Brexit himself for many years, one could almost feel sorry for him. But so much for the superpower. Since the Leave vote, British Prime Ministers have been pointing out particularly frequently that Great Britain is one of the few European states that are able to become militarily active internationally within a short period of time. But that has nothing to do with Brexit. Even as an EU member, Great Britain has taken part in military operations abroad, for example in Iraq, Bosnia and Afghanistan. And if you take a closer look at the operational readiness of the British Armed Forces, a lot of the gloss quickly peels off now. Tragically, the economic consequences of Brexit are now hitting many of the economically disadvantaged regions that voted in favor of leaving the EU in 2016. And they get hit particularly hard. And the fact that people that voted for Brexit often had less to do with a longing for world power status than with a desire to be heard. After taking office in 2010, then Prime Minister David Cameron used the recession following the financial crisis to launch a draconian and deeply ideological austerity program. The ostensible goal of eliminating the deficit was never achieved. Instead, the austerity policy prolonged the economic crisis for years. Public services, especially the NHS, were severely damaged. And in 2019, then Prime Minister Theresa May quietly abandoned the project. But the consequences were already devastating. A study published in 2022 in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health concluded that austerity could have caused around 335,000 additional deaths nationwide between 2012 and 2019. David Cameron was apparently unaware of the extent of the disruption he had caused in many parts of the country with his draconian austerity measures when he called for the EU referendum on June 23rd of that year in February 2016. However, the central role in what is probably the greatest act of national self-sabotage in recent years falls to another protagonist, and that's Boris Johnson. A simple fact shows how calculating the gifted opportunist and bullshitter Johnson was at the time. Johnson described in a column in the conservative Daily Telegraph why he was in favor of leaving the EU. It later became known that he had also written an alternative column at the same time, and in that one he spoke out in favor of remaining in the EU. In previous years, Johnson had repeatedly stated that he was not an outer. He apparently only made his decision at the last minute. But this does not indicate a deep conviction. The Vote Leave campaign, however, received a significant boost from Johnson, and he quickly became the figurehead of Brexit supporters. With his liberal image as mayor of the global metropolis of London, Johnson gave the hitherto embittered right-wing populist project a moderate veneer. And today hardly anyone doubts that Johnson only supported the Leave campaign because he hoped to gain a political advantage from it. Apparently, Johnson did not believe that Leave would win. When the Leave side surprisingly won the referendum, Johnson's horror was evident. The morning after the referendum, he read out a statement with a stony expression. There was no trace of Johnson's chummy enthusiasm. He only looked up from the paper briefly, only to immediately lower his gaze again, as if he could not bear to look people in the eye. It took another 3 years before Johnson achieved his declared life goal and became Prime Minister. But in office, as expected, Johnson became so quickly entangled in lies and scandals that his own cabinet ousted him in September 22. And many Britons realized at the time that they had been taken in by a political con artist. It dawned on them that Johnson's Brexit promises were probably not much more than just hot air. And you don't have to look far today for signs that the Brexit project is failing. There is still no sign of the much vaunted new global trade agreements that Brexit was supposed to make possible. London has signed 71 free trade agreements or trade agreements since leaving the EU. However, 68 of them are so-called rollover agreements that date back to the time when the country was part of the European single market. New trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, which London likes to celebrate as Brexit successes, have little economic significance. In return, British agriculture will suffer if, in accordance with the agreements, which experts believe are highly one-sided, more and more Australian and New Zealand meat can be exported to Great Britain duty-free in the coming years. At the same time, the government is rapidly reducing agricultural subsidies from the EU era. Planned alternative payments that are intended to reward farmers more for things like landscape maintenance are only slowly getting off the ground. It is no wonder that, according to a survey by the National Farmers Union, the mood among British farmers is worse than it has been for a long time. The number of Brexit supporters among farmers was indeed particularly high. The price that the country is paying for the Brexit utopia is also high. The spending watchdogs at the Office for Budget Responsibility estimate that British trade volume has been 15% lower since the EU referendum than it would have been if it had continued to be a member of the EU. And as a result, British economic output will probably be 4% lower over a period of 15 years than it would have been without leaving the EU. But hasn't leaving the EU made the country more democratic? Here too the opposite has happened. Due to the ongoing economic problems, which Brexit has undoubtedly exacerbated, the government in London has become increasingly authoritarian since Johnson's time as Prime Minister. The plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda before their procedures have been completed there, which is illegal even from the point of view of the British judiciary, is moving Britain towards being a pariah state internationally. And with the planned deportations, which date back to Johnson's time as Prime Minister, Sunak is fighting against further evidence that Brexit has failed as an ideological concept. Last year, despite a restrictive immigration policy, net immigration rose to a new record of 745,000 people. In the run-up to the referendum, representatives of the Leave side repeatedly indicated that leaving the EU would lead to a decline in immigration. Among people who have to live with the consequences of the failed Brexit project on a daily basis, enthusiasm for leaving the EU is now limited. According to a recent survey, only 1 in 10 Britons believes that Brexit has improved their financial situation. Almost 2/3 believe that Brexit has contributed to inflation and the higher cost of living. And only 22% said that Brexit has been positive for the country. And there is now a name for the phenomenon, and that's regret. So it's time to think about a rejoin, so a joining of the EU, while the Labour Party, which according to all polls will replace the government of the hapless Brexit supporter Sunak after the upcoming parliamentary elections, is playing down the issue. Under Labour, Great Britain will neither join the European single market nor the customs union, as the party leadership announced some time ago. Labour leader Keir Starmer, however, wants to improve relations with the country's largest and most important trading partner in any case. And the Labour leadership is obviously wary of reopening the wounds that have only just began to heal and that the years of Brexit dispute have torn into the British society. Hardly anyone in Britain or the EU is currently in the mood for a new round of Brexit bickering. Labour insiders, however, are murmuring that this currently rather rigid stance could change in a few years. If it becomes clear over time that a clear majority of the people in the country want an end to the Brexit experiment, the hope is that a future Labour government could start a debate that would bring Britain significantly closer to its European neighbours. In any case, the right-wing populist Brexit utopia has already failed. But I have to make one thing clear that doesn't seem to come over good enough usually. Even if Britain ever decides that they want to go back to the EU, it will take a long time because they have to fulfill all the criteria every other country has to fulfill when it wants to join the EU, because there is no rejoin. They would join as any other new member. And I can tell you one thing very clear. At the moment, the UK does not bring the criteria necessary for it, even if they would send an application right now. Just to make that one clear. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.